Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Michael Fraud. I am the Assistant Program Director for Drisha. Thrilled to have you all here with us as part of this class that we are going to be enjoying tonight on the Kapparah of Yom Kippur. This is the fourth of a five-part series with Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Zuckier as part of Drisha's Elul programming. Rabbi Dr. Zuckier is one of our Drisha faculty members, as well as a postdoctoral fellow in Jewish studies at McGill University. He's a recent graduate of Yale's PhD program in religious studies and of Yeshiva University's Kollel Elyon. This course has been focusing on the questions about how atonement comes about on Yom Kippur. Is it dependent on Korbanot? Does it still atone today? Does one need to observe the day of Yom Kippur in any particular way in order to achieve atonement? What do various pieces of this process tell us about the nature of the day of Yom Kippur itself? So tonight's class is going to build on some of the material that we saw last week in terms of the relationship between Yom Kippur today and Yom Kippur in the time of the temple, as well as Yom Kippur, or the Yom Kippur Korbanot, the sacrifices that were given in ancient times that were part of Yom Kippur, and how that interacts with Yom Kippur today in a time where we are not able to offer those Korbanot. So Rabbi Zuckier, whenever you're ready, I think we can get started.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So as Michael mentioned, today's Shiur builds on last week's, but we'll make sure to review all the relevant points and to build from there. So last week we mostly spoke about a couple of different sugyas, a couple of different Talmudic discussions about what atonement was like in the time of the temple, the time of the Beis HaMikdash, when there were multiple different sacrifices brought on Yom Kippur that were not, that are pretty unique to Yom Kippur and have an expiatory function or have an atoning function. And the question is, if nowadays Yom Kippur atones, and in the time of the Mikdash, these sacrifices atoned, what did the day of Yom Kippur do in the time of the Mikdash? So that's sort of question number one, and we saw a variety of views, and we're going to quickly mention some of them and develop some others further. The related question, the question that builds on that is, okay, once we figure out what the role of Yom Kippur was in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, Yom Kippur as a day, as opposed to the Korbanos brought, once we figure out the role of Yom Kippur as a day in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, we can then sort of roll the process forward and say, well, what about nowadays? What changed between the time of the Mikdash and now? Is it just that, there used to be a sacrificial option or a day option, and the sacrificial option is no longer available, but the day option remains the same? Essentially, nothing, the only thing that changed is we have access to fewer options, or is there some metaphysical change, so to speak, in the nature of Yom Kippur as an atoning function, or in some way or other that's relevant for us today? And that, of course, the more there's a change, the more interesting that is, and we have to probe why that would be the case and what the implications of that are. So that's the big picture of what we're doing. And again, last time we started getting into some of these issues. So if you look at today's handout, source number one, which I cut down a bit from last time, and it's basically the first parak of Mishnah in Masechet Shavuos, and for whatever reason, the first parak there talks about different atoning sacrifices, different communal atoning sacrifices that atone for Tumas Mikdash V'Kadsha, that atone for defiling the temple with ritual impurity. We're not going to get into the details of that, but one thing that came up again and again with the various sacrifices of Yom Kippur, both the Sa'ir Hanasa B'Chutz, the chatas that's brought in the Azara outside of the Heichal, and the Sa'ir Nasa B'Pnim, the chatas goat that's brought inside the Heichal, inside the Kodesh, and the third being the Sa'ir La'azazel, the Sa'ir Mishtaleach, the goat that's sent into the wilderness. All three of those on Yom Kippur atone. The question is, how do they atone? Do they atone alone? There's a nice rhyme to it. Or are they functioning somehow with assistance from Yom Kippur? And we're not gonna read this inside, but if you glance at the sheets in source number one, you'll notice that on some of the atoning features it says Sayir Nasa Bifnim V'Yom Kippurim Tola, or Sayir Nasa B'chutz V'Yom Kippurim Mechaper. That it sounds like the offering, the sacrificial offering, atones along with Yom Kippur, Yom Kippurim. Makes it sound like there's like a combination. The sacrifice itself isn't sufficient. It needs some, whatever you want to call it, metaphysical power, expiatory force of the day of Yom Kippur in order to work. That's what it sounds like from the beginning of our Mishnah. What gets complicated is the end of the Mishnah. It talks about the Sira Lazazel, the Sira Mishtaleach, the scapegoat. And there it doesn't say that the day of Yom Kippur helps at all. So it makes you wonder, is it the same? And we saw last week, there's a variety of views of how to read the Mishnah. So some people say when you say vi, that the Sa'ir and Yom Kippur are machaper. That doesn't mean that the two are working in tandem, that they're working together. Maybe it means that it doesn't mean and, it means or. It means that either the Sa'ir, either the goat, it atones, or the day of Yom Kippur atones. That was one option. Another option is that really it doesn't say Sa'ir Nasa B'chutz vi Yom Kippur Mechaper. It says Sa'ir Nasa B'chutz bi Yom Kippur Mechaper in the proper girsa. So not the goat and the day. It's the goat on the day, the goat that happens to be brought on the day of Yom Kippur. But the day of Yom Kippur itself is not providing any expiatory power on that view. It's just the day it happens to be brought. I mean, you can't bring these korbanos on other days, presumably, but the day itself is not doing anything. It's just a coincidence. It happens to be the day that it's brought. So that's another option. We looked at the manuscript, the Kaufman manuscript last week, and it said neither Sayir Nasa B'chutz V'Yom Kippurim nor Sayir Nasa B'chutz B'Yom Kippurim. It actually just said Sayir Nasa B'chutz Yom Kippurim Mechaper, which you said is pretty ungrammatical, and the sentence doesn't really work. But this leads us to be suspicious that maybe some alternate textual versions were going around, and that could explain it as well. So at the end of the day, we have three different views in reading that Mishnah as to what atones on Yom Kippur in the time of the temple. Either it's the sacrifices alone, and it doesn't say V'Yom Kippur, it says B'Yom Kippurim, or it says the sacrifices V'Yom Kippurim and they really work together. You need both of them together in tandem. Alternatively, the third option is that it says Vi, but Vi doesn't mean and, it means or. So the third option is that either the sacrifices on Yom Kippur or the day itself atone, and you have like a fail-safe. You have you have two options that work, and it's a good thing you have the fail-safe, because nowadays, on that view, we lack the sacrifices of Yom Kippur, but we still have the day. So it worked out very well. It was good that the fail-safe was in place from the beginning, according to that view. Those are the three views of reading that Mishnah there. And we saw it got a little complicated. If you look at the different Rishonim, the Rashi talks about it, and a lot of Achronim talk about it, and maybe this question actually is a dispute among the Tanaim. Whatever it is, however you resolve it exactly, those are the three basic views. The other thing we started getting into last week, but I think I want to jump back into this because it's a little complex, and I think we need to get back into the some of the weeds here in order to better appreciate the larger picture. Is what is this question of how the Sayir Lazazel how exactly it works, and more precisely when it works. What is the scope of sins that are atoned for by the Sayir Lazazel, and particularly a scenario where, let's say they send the scapegoat out into the wilderness, maybe they throw it off a cliff. They do that at 3 p.m. on Yom Kippur. Okay, that's the time they do it. And then let's say someone does a sin at 4 p.m. after the Sayir Mishlech is already brought. So did you miss out on your atonement for this year? You need to wait till next year to get atoned for? Or no, you actually somehow get atoned for don't by the Sayir, by this scapegoat, despite the fact that it was brought before you actually sinned. And this question is not a theoretical question. I don't know if it ever happened per se like this exactly, but it's discussed by the Gemara. The Gemara raises this question. It's not a new question that we came up with. It's in the Gemara. So source number 2 for those following on the source sheet. So the Gemara says Umoda Rabbi Caries the Yoma, and just a reminder, this is Rabbi, the opinion of Rabbi that we studied in great detail 2 weeks ago, that Yom Kippur that the day of Yom Kippur atones fully with no need for tshuva. You don't need to do tshuva. All you need is the day of Yom Kippur, and you have all your all your sins wiped away. And so the question, with maybe 3 exceptions for things that are like a super sins of Chil Hashem, but not your usual super sin categories. In any event, so the Gemara says Rabbi must admit that his principle is not true about Caries the Yoma, about sins done on Yom Kippur that violate the day of Yom Kippur, like for example eating on Yom Kippur, right? For those who are supposed to be fasting, or doing malacha, doing work on Yom Kippur, right? So let's say eating on Yom Kippur, it says you get Caries, you get excision for eating on Yom Kippur. You don't have if you don't have a dispensation for health or other reasons. So the question is, according to Rabbi, how would you ever get this punishment of Caries for eating on Yom Kippur? Because as soon as you eat, you're immediately atoned, because it's Yom Kippur, and on Yom Kippur you immediately get atonement for all your sins, regardless of whether you do tshuva, according to Rabbi. So we're saying Rabbi, and that can't be, must be Rabbi has an out. Rabbi has an exception to his rule. Usually you get atonement by the day of Yom Kippur for everything, except for sins that violate Yom Kippur itself. Caries the Yoma, let's say eating on Yom Kippur. Caries Yom Kippur, the Rabbi Leisley. If that weren't the case, there'd be no scenario where you ever got Caries in Yom Kippur. You'd always get atoned immediately. And now the Gemara raises all sorts of interesting scenarios, including one we talked about before, that are proposed cases of where you would get excision, even within Rebbe's approach. So it says, Alam alom, maybe you sinned at night, and maybe Yom Kippur only atones during the daytime, not at night. Maybe that's an exception for Rebbe. Okay, fine. Even if that's a good case, you're saying that you can never get Caries for eating during the day on Yom Kippur, according to Rebbe. That feels wrong. It feels like if you eat on Yom Kippur, you should be getting Caries. You shouldn't have an automatic out like Rebbe says. So what do we explain? Maybe you ate a bone and died immediately. Or maybe you eat right before sundown. There's no time to get atonement. You die immediately in the act while sinning, or the day ends while you're still in the act. There's no time for the day to come in and give you atonement. So Tosfos then comes in and says, let's think about the scenario a little bit. Right? Let's say we can have another answer to the Gemara's question. If someone eats at 4 p.m. after the Shiur Mishalech was sent out at 3 p.m., maybe that's the case where Rebbe would admit, usually Yom Kippur atones for everyone without tshuva. But that's only if you bring the sacrifices of Yom Kippur. And if you've already brought them, it's too late. You missed the Yom Kippur boat, and maybe you wouldn't get atonement. So let's quickly read Tosfos inside. And he makes the following suggestion. The Gemara can't, and it certainly doesn't, establish the case as what we just talked about, where you do your sin, you eat your food on Yom Kippur after having brought the scapegoat. The Gemara doesn't raise that case. Why not? It wouldn't have worked to bring this case. Why not? Because the scapegoat atones all day. Even if you bring it at 3 o'clock, it continues atoning after it's brought until the end of the day of Yom Kippur. That's Tosfos' starting point. Now they have a problem. But how can that be? We have a rule, and this is a pretty reasonable rule if you think about it. Sacrifices only atone for things that came before. That's the whole point. You do an avera, and you bring a carbon to fix it. Not you bring a carbon in advance and fix all your future sins. We don't have a concept of that. Maybe that's Taras Nadar, but that's a different thing. Right? There's no idea. You can't get a dispensation for violating beforehand. There's no such thing. You can get atonement afterwards, but this case, he's sinning after the Shiur, after the sacrifice. So how can you get atonement in that case? So he says, fine. The Gemara discusses this principle earlier. Even if it's the same day, you still can't get retroactive tshuva. So how does he answer this? He gives 3 answers. Shani sari mishtaleach dichsiv be kivayom hazeh yichaper aleichem atareschem mikol zeichem mashma dekol hayom yichaper. We have a special pasuk. Pasuk tells us kibayom hazeh. What does that mean, kibayom hazeh? How do we translate that?
Like on this day, or
on this day. That's one translation. And maybe that's what Tosfos means. Maybe Tosfos just says like the atonement is on this day, meaning on the whole day. And even if you brought the goat already, it works across the whole day. That's possible. What's the alternative translation of ki bayom hazeh? I think we talked about this 3 weeks ago. So this is like a super bonus question. So it might be what they call the instrumental bet, the instrumental base, right? The not on this day, but with this day, using this day. Bayom hazeh yichaber lechem. You'll get atonement using the day itself. Meaning maybe Tosfos, and this the Gemara, the Sifra that we saw also 3 weeks ago, makes this exact drasha. Bayom hazeh teaches us that nowadays, without sacrifice, the day still atones. So, however, it's not exactly clear what Tosfos's translation of that pasuk would be, but it sounds like he's saying the fact that Yom Kippur is mixed in with the atonement of the scapegoat, of the Shlomo, that allows for the scapegoat to atone even after it's brought, to atone in advance, only because of the day, meaning the sire, the goat is already sent, but you have Yom Kippur for the rest of the day. So since it's a Yom Kippur atonement, it will continue to atone even after the scapegoat is sent, after the offering is brought, so to speak. So what does this answer assume in terms of, if we had to plot based on what we saw before? Do the sacrifices work independently of Yom Kippur, or do they work along with Yom Kippur? What comes out of Tosfos of this answer? Right? Why would it be, again, let's think this through. If this were a normal sacrifice, it could never atone prospectively. It could never atone on the future. That doesn't make sense. Somehow, the fact that this is brought on Yom Kippur by Yom Hazeh, it's on this day, the atonement can work prospectively. Why would that be? What would that indicate about the nature of the Sir Mishalech, of the scapegoat, and its atonement? Right? Why would this be the exception? Just because you have some pasuk, what does that tell us? Why does it atone on the future? So I think the only way to explain it is to say that that it's integrated into the day, meaning the atonement doesn't come just from the goat itself. It comes from some combination between the scapegoat's atoning power and the day's atoning power. They integrate in some sense, and how exactly we can think about it a bit more, we will. They must integrate in some way, which is what allows for this prospective atonement, for atonement after the sacrifices, because it's not the sacrifice alone that's doing the atoning, it's the sacrifice integrated into the day as this, it's a package deal. It's not just the seer that's atoning, it's the sire on Yom Kippur. Together, those two factors that are atoning. So in that case, you're not actually atoning on the future, you're atoning on the past from the perspective of the day, right? The day is still ongoing and continues to atone. I think that's answer number one in Tosfos. So that implies that the day and the sacrifices are working together. Inamia, second answer. Hayom atzmo, below Sayer Mishtaleach, Mechaper, Ktsas, Ve'en Kan Caries Gamur. Another reason why the Gemara doesn't give this answer of the sinning at 4 o'clock after the Sir Mishtaleach is brought is because, you know what? The truth is the Sir Mishtaleach is irrelevant. It's ineffective after it's brought. But there's something else. There's an independent factor called the day of Yom Kippur that atones not what he said before, not answer number one, that the day is integrated with the goat and they atone together. No, the day atones independently, but it doesn't atone fully. It's only mechaper ktsas, only partially atones, but it atones enough to prevent you from getting Caries. You don't get the punishment of excision, so that wouldn't work for our sugya. And then he gives a third answer, skipping a few lines, v'yesh mefarshim, Yom Kippur below Sarim Shalech mechaper legamre, or maybe the day of Yom Kippur atones fully in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. So you brought your Sarim Shalech, great, you got full atonement, good. But you know what? You have in your back pocket, you have this backup, right? This redundant system that gives you full atonement twice every Yom Kippur, once through the Sarim Shalech, a second time through the day, and that's why that wouldn't be a good example in our Gemara. So all three of Tosfos' answers seem to imply that the day has at least some role in atoning in the time of the temple. Yes? So that's one perspective. That's one angle, and the role that the day has varies here a little bit, right? There's three possible roles that the day may have. It may function along with the sacrifices, like working in tandem. It might work independently and completely, right? It might do the full job by itself, or it might work independently but only partially, right? It might be only half effective, mechaper k'tzas, in the time of the temple on its own, whereas the Shiur, the scapegoat, is doing the full atonement at the time. So we'll pause here for any questions, but that's Tosfos's view, and it's an important view. All of three of these opinions have some role for the day of Yom Kippur in the time of the temple. We'll see not everyone agrees to that. Questions, thoughts?
So I was thinking about, this is a little off track and feel free to like disregard this, but we do sort of we do reward behavior in the future. Like you can't do a sacrifice to atone for something in the future, but we have all of these, like things that will be rewarded in Olam Haba. And I was just curious if you had thought about any connection there, about like things the rabbis think like good deeds can be a future rewarded, but you can't like atone in the future for the future.
What do you just give an example just so I have more clarity? Something that's rewarded in the future, meaning you do a mitzvah,
like
you get a
like elu devorim, like the thing, like these things that you may be rewarded for in this world, you would also be rewarded for in the world to come.
Right. And I guess you could say the same about sin, right? You sin now and you get punished later. So I think the difference is that sacrifices don't function the same way as standard reward and punishment, right? Standard reward and punishment, you do something good, you get rewarded later. You do something bad, you get punished later. The point of a sacrifice is not, it's a good deed, it's like a nice mitzvah that you did. The point of a sacrifice, it's backwards looking by definition, right? Not all sacrifices, but the atoning sacrifices, the chatas and asham. So you read Vayikra, Perik Dal, Perik Hey, it says, if you do an avera, you bring a carbon, a chatas or an asham to atone for the avera, depending on the details of the case, if it qualifies. By definition, that's backwards looking, right? Korban doesn't work on the future, right? Korbanos only work on the past. Now, at least the chatas and asham. You can talk about the ola, sort of maybe that gives you like mitzvah points, but that wouldn't resolve a sin on the future. So I think there's just a fundamental difference between doing mitzvahs and getting rewarded for them versus bringing sacrifices and atoning and fixing a previous harm. The mashal, the parable we can use is, when you violate the Torah, it's in a sense an affront to God, right? We have this covenant, we have this list of laws, things that we're not supposed to do, things we are supposed to do, things we're not supposed to do. If you violate them, that's an affront to God. That's breaking the relationship, and you need to make up for it. So you make up for it with sacrifices, right? That's, at least classically, that's the way of doing it. And some sacrifices play more of I don't know if you want to call it quieting God's anger, like after the Mabul, right? After the Mabul, sort of appeasing divine anger over what had been done previously. Sometimes it's more forward-looking. It's like a gift to build a relationship. Whatever it is, they're all the ones that involve sin are certainly looking backwards and trying to fix the way the relationship was ruined. And I guess this is very relevant seasonally, which of course makes sense given the reason this topic's being taught now. It was the same thing for tshuva, right? Tshuva fundamentally is backwards looking. The point is you did something wrong, you ruined a relationship either with God or with people. With people, there's an added, there's sort of three parties. It gets a little more complicated, but you damaged the relationship and now you need to fix it. But you can't do tshuva on sins you haven't done yet, right? In fact, I think this is, we saw this in the previous class. Even if you don't even do the tshuva now, you say you'll do the tshuva later, I'll sin now and do the tshuva later, we don't let you do tshuva, right? So you can't like preload your tshuva. That doesn't work. Same way, you can't preload a sacrifice. The point of the sacrifice, it has to be correcting some mistake done previously. Does that respond to the question? Yeah, okay, good. Any other questions, thoughts, ideas? Okay, so let's move forward. We're going to skip sources 4 and 5 for now. Maybe we'll come back if we have extra time. But the best contrast to Tosfos is the Rambam. Tosfos, remember, had given 3 different answers as to how the day of Yom Kippur played an expiatory role in the time of the Mikdash. Either it worked with the sacrifice, or it worked independently fully, or it worked independently partly. And the Rambam seems to go in a different direction. First of all, Rambam on the Mishnah and Shavuos that we saw last week seems to very clearly have a girsa of Sira Nasa B'chutz B'Yom HaKippurim. That it's not, there's no factor of Yom Kippur in the atonement. It's just that that's the day you happen to bring the carbon that's brought on Yom Kippur, not the carbon that's brought plus Yom Kippur. So that's number one. Number two, here in source number 6, the Rambam talks about the categories of tshuva. Sorry, the categories of kapparah, I should say, right? And we're going to see the Rambam's going to say that tshuva is always relevant, but there's a major difference. There's a historical difference between how atonement is achieved in temple times versus how atonement is achieved nowadays. With the big difference being, at least one of the differences being whether to what extent the day of Yom Kippur plays a role, as opposed to the sacrifices. And there's also another difference will be the categories of suffering and death, which the Rambam doesn't really emphasize here, emphasize in terms of the time of the temple, whereas they do apply nowadays. But fine, let's jump into the source. Source number 6, and we'll start about halfway through. So the second paragraph here. Seir mishtaleach, the scapegoat, the goat that's sent out, Lefishu Kapparah al kol Yisrael, it atones for the whole Jewish people. Therefore, Kohen Gadol misvada alav, the high priest recites vidui confession on it, al lashon kol Yisrael, using the language of the whole Jewish people. Shenemar misvada alav is kol avonos bnei Yisrael. He confesses for the sins of the whole Jewish people. Fine. Seir mishtaleach mechaper al kol aver shebatorah, hakalos v'achamuros, ben shavar b'zada, ben shavar b'shkaga. The scapegoat is the super mechaper, right? It atones for everything, intentional or unintentional, major or minor, whether you knew you were sinning or not. In all cases, this scapegoat atones for it. That's a quote from the Gemara. Rambam throws in here what's a dispute. He rules like the opinion that v'husha asa tshuva. You need tshuva. Tshuva is like a condition, a basic condition, a prerequisite for all this to work. But what's the big mechaper? What's the great atoning agent that does all the work? It's the scapegoat. It's the seir hamishtalech. He says, you don't do tshuva, then you're in trouble. You don't do tshuva, the scapegoat only atones for the minor sins, then you're left with all your major sins. He gives definitions as to what's a big sin, what's a small sin. Moving to the next paragraph, right? So that's in the time of the temple. In the time of the temple, what do you have what are the atoning agents in the time of the temple? Either one or two. What are they?
Sacrifices.
Sacrifices, and particularly for our purposes, the seir mishtaleach, the scapegoat. But yes, certainly other sacrifices too. Chatas, asham, right? That's one factor. What's the other factor potentially? The other factor is, yeah, Zoe?
Like the day of Yom Kippur ceremony, is that?
Well, does he say that? He doesn't really say that.
No.
What he says is tshuva, right? Tshuva is a factor as well, although it's not clear if it's doing some of the atonement work or is tshuva simply like a condition. Like without tshuva, you can't possibly get atonement, because what would it mean for you to not regret what you're doing and get atonement for it? But maybe it's not actually doing the work. Let's move to nowadays. And the Rambam says, "Bisman hazeh, she'ein beis hamikdash kayim, ve'ein lanu mizbach kapara, ein sham ela tshuva." Right? This makes a lot of sense. It says nowadays, right? Think about it. There's two factors of atonement in the time of the temple: sacrifices and repentance and tshuva. Nowadays, we don't have the sacrifices. So what are we left with? All there is tshuva, but then it's going to get more complicated. But at least the starting point is all that's left is tshuva as an atoning agent. Tshuva mechaperes al kol averos. Not only that, it sounds like, and we're going to talk about this more in a bit, tshuva steps up and fills in for all atonement, right? It fills in for the seir mishtaleach fully. It atones for everything. And then he says, even if you're like, you violated the Torah your whole life, and only at the end of your life you come back, it works. And then he says, and he says there's this other new category called Yom Kippurim, the day of Yom Kippur itself, which atones for those who do tshuva. So the Rambam in the next halacha talks about the other categories, the suffering and death, as atoning categories as well. But what's very clear from what we read is that the day of Yom Kippur exists as an atoning agent, but only nowadays. In the time of the temple, it wasn't there, right? It doesn't appear in halacha beis. It only appears in halacha gimel because it wasn't true. It didn't exist as an atoning agent in the time of the temple for good reason. You didn't need the day because you had the sacrifices. You had the seir mishtaleach, right? Which, whether or not it's a sacrifice is a whole question, but whatever, it's like a sacrifice if it's not a sacrifice, right? So nowadays we have this new category, the day of Yom Kippur, but it didn't exist beforehand at all, and that's why on the Mishnah the Rambam doesn't have a girsa of Yom HaKippurim. The day of Yom Kippur does not participate at all in the atoning process. It's the sacrifices plus tshuva. That's all you need. So that's the Rambam, and we'll see the Rambam is not alone with this idea that the atoning effect of Yom Kippur is a new thing. In fact, the Ritva, another classic Rishon here in source number 7 says similarly. He says, he's in the weeds in the Zuckier we saw before. He says, we see from here the underline piece. The Rabbi, Yom Kippur mechaper al she'enam shavim da'afilu al krisos u'misos bez. In Rebbe's opinion that we discussed before, right? That you get full atonement without tshuva for all sins, even major sins like Caries and misos bez, and things you get the death penalty for, things you get excision for. It atones for all that. Eino beitzumo shel yom bilvad ella im korbanot is mancha v'seng mikdash kaya. So Rebbe's opinion in the time of the temple does not involve the day itself. It requires the sacrifices. And it sounds like maybe they're working together, but certainly the day as an independent atoning agent did not exist in the time of the temple. You needed the sacrifices. Even though Rebbe's position, it didn't necessarily sound like that. He says Yom Kippur atones with or without the sacrifices. Yom Kippur atones with or without atonement, with or without repentance, rather. Right? So what he says is the day itself does it. The Ritva comes in and says you also need the sacrifices. Skip to the next underlined piece. Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yishmael's opinion that there's 4 categories of atonement: Tshuva, Yom Kippur, suffering, and death. That opinion is talking about nowadays. Nowadays, Yom Kippur atones independently, but in the time of the temple, it did not. You needed sacrifice in order for Yom Kippur to atone. So according to both the Ritva and the Rambam, there's a major shift in terms of what the day of Yom Kippur can do. In the time of the temple, Yom Kippur could not atone independently. According to the Rambam, it sounds like it did nothing. Only the Korbanos did all the work. According to the Ritva, there was some partnership between the day and the sacrifices, but both of them would agree that the day itself could not independently atone in the time of the temple, but nowadays it can. So on that view, you have to say there was some sort of metaphysical shift. The nature of atonement and the nature of the day of Yom Kippur somehow shifted so that Yom Kippur, the day itself, yields atonement now, whereas it did not independently yield atonement in the past. So I think that's pretty cool, right? Usually we're not used to, usually historians say, this changed in Judaism. It's always been the same. We always have the same halachos. And here we have Rishonim saying very explicitly that the Ritva, the Rambam, saying, hey, there's a historical shift here on a metaphysical level, right? The nature of atonement of Yom Kippur exists now and did not exist independently during the time of the temple. That's pretty cool. So what we need to figure out now is why. Why would it be that there was this change, and how exactly does it work, and why does it work? So I'm happy to take some thoughts and ideas here, or questions or suggestions. Everyone's welcome to throw those out, and I'm also going to reshare the file because apparently it's not working for some people. So hopefully we'll try it a different way and see what happens. Although it seems to not be letting me send files. So maybe I'll send it to Michael. Maybe I'll send it. Do you have the file, Michael?
Yeah.
I can't share it in the box.
If you resend it to me, I'll see what I can do about sending it out and seeing if I can.
Okay.
Do something.
Great. So we'll do while we're doing that. Any suggestions? Why would it be that the day of Yom Kippur would all of a sudden take on a new expiatory role? Now all of a sudden it atones where it didn't used to atone previously. I mean, I think part of the answer is clear, which is necessity, right? You don't have a temple, so you need to have something. But what's the nature of that shift? How exactly does it work? So very happy to take some suggestions on that. What are people thinking? I could put people on the spot. That would be a bit much. But yeah, Zoe, what do you think?
This reminded me of grad school, so I was jumping first. Like, I guess there's a, like, did the day always have this power question, right? That's coming up of like, back when you could actually do the ceremony. Like, I guess, yeah, that's what I'm sort of hung up on right now. It's just like, what is the transference of like the day of Yom Kippur from the time of the temple until then when you can't do these things? And like you said, it was out of necessity, but there's also just like what role did this day play, maybe even with the temple? Like, were all of the ceremonies as described necessary in order to obtain atonement in the time of the temple? Because if not, then like, how can we get away with it now, as it were?
Right, exactly. So you have something weird. You have something a bit funny with Zoe that you're pointing to. Thank you. Which is, if the system, I mean, like basic facts. Nowadays, there's no sacrifice. Then there were sacrifices, and everyone thinks that there is atonement now, and there was atonement then. So either something changed or something was redundant, right? You can't have, in like a perfect world, the system never would change and nothing would ever be redundant, right? It's a perfectly efficient system. That can't be the case here, given the basic input, the facts that we're inputting, right? That the system is different then than now, and yet we get atonement either way. So it's not a fully efficient system. So what's the redundancy? What's the change? I think that's a helpful way of thinking about it. And I think we saw when we studied the Mishnah, there's a couple of views. One view is that there's this massive redundancy in the time of the temple, right? You have either sacrificial atonement or the day atoning. Both of those exist at the same time. And nowadays we just lost one of the options, but the other option is still fully in place. Nothing changed really. There's just this pragmatic inability to do sacrifice, but the nature of the atonement of Yom Kippur didn't change at all. Right? So that view is, it has the upside of not assuming change, assuming that's a good thing, and then has the downside of redundancy. Like, why would God say, it foretold, the system is set up assuming that there would be a destruction of the temple or something like that. That's one approach. The other approach is to go the opposite extreme and say, no, it totally changed, right? There used to be the day did nothing, and now the day does everything. Why? Because of necessity. You lost the sacrifice, and we're not going to have no atonement, so the day has to step in, right? So, and how does the day step in? There's different ways of thinking about that. Or you might say that the day steps in totally, absolutely, and whatever Yom Kippur through the sacrifices used to do, now it accomplishes through the day itself. There's actually a formulation like that. I think it's in the Tosfos Rush, if I'm not mistaken. I don't have the line right now. One of the Rishonim says that it says whatever Yom Kippur, here, it's actually the next source. That's why I put it there. Source number 8. Let's take a look at this. Sefer Nir, it's a commentary in the Yerushalmi, and Achron, but he just sort of throws in passing, within the opinion there, whatever the scapegoat used to atone in the past, today, the day of Yom Kippur atones. So basically, the day just is a total stand-in for the sacrifices. That sounds pretty reasonable. In fact, if those of us who remember from the first year, the Sifra says, well, I can understand from the Torah that you get atonement through sacrifice on Yom Kippur. How do I know you also get atonement from the day? It says, Ki ba Yom hazeh, through this day you atone. And that's how we know you get atonement through the day as well. It's not clear how to read that Sifra, that medrash. Or you might read that medrash as saying, all along, both of these options were in place. Or you might read the medrash as saying, in the time of the temple, there were sacrifices, you got atonement through that. Nowadays, the nature of the day of Yom Kippur shifts to stand in for the sacrifices, right? And then we have a drasha to understand that in the Pesukim. Maybe that's only talking about nowadays. So that would be an interesting way of reading that Sifra, and that's what this Sefer Nir seems to be asserting, or going in that direction, right? That whatever the sacrifices used to do, now the day accomplishes. And why would that, like, what's the mechanism for that? I think there's a couple different ways of thinking about this. Anyone have thoughts as to, in terms of what the mechanism is? Like, how does that work? How can you just, like, slap the day on it and you get atonement or whatever, right? How does that work? It's not the same as the sacrifices, right? Any suggestions on that, or should we look at one of the sources, or what do people want? Okay, we'll look at some sources. So the Kavod Chachamim, another commentary in the Yerushalmi, he makes an interesting point. He says, he talks about, he's trying to explain, we saw this a bit before, the idea that the night of Yom Kippur might not atone. He's trying to explain why that would be, right? Why would it be that the daytime of Yom Kippur atones nowadays, but not the nighttime? Why would there be a difference? He says, Ve'efshar, this is a bit into the underlined part, to who my time, she'al kol panim, tzarech shehaya ra'ui lechaper, b'sa'ir, d'hainu bayom. He says, how does the atonement of the day of Yom Kippur work? It works. Well, first he says it works only in times when you could have brought the scapegoat, right? So if it's daytime hours, when it's, you're eligible to bring the scapegoat, then Yom Kippur atones. If it's nighttime hours, when you can't bring the scapegoat, Yom Kippur will not atone. But what's the logic for that position? What is he basically assuming for this to make sense, right? Why would Yom Kippur only atone at times that one theoretically could bring the scapegoat? I think the only way to understand it is that he views Yom Kippur nowadays, it's not like the day itself atones, like somehow the day qua day. It's the day is a virtual Sir Mishtaleh. Yom Kippur nowadays, it's not just the day of Yom Kippur. We added in, we sort of have this virtual scapegoat that happens all day. We sort of, Yom Kippur nowadays is a series of, is just one long period of as if we're bringing the Sir Mishtaleh at every moment or something like that. And for that reason, it atones. It atones not as the day, but it atones as a pseudo or as a virtual Sir Mishtaleh, right? We know all about virtual things. We're in a virtual room right now. So, right, why can't Yom Kippur be a virtual Sir Mishtaleh, a virtual scapegoat? And that's what it is, and that's how it works. That's one way of understanding it. Another way of understanding is to say, no, it's not that the day is a virtual scapegoat. It's just that the day's nature takes on this expiatory function. It's not like it's reliving the sacrifice. It's working totally independent of Sir Mishtaleh. Someone who takes that second view, that it actually works differently. It's not like a pseudo. It's not like a virtual sacrifice on Yom Kippur. It's the Yom Kippur itself that functions to atone. One person who makes that point is the Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik in his Al Tshuva. I think I have it here, both in Hebrew and in English. He has a very interesting idea. He wants to say that the nature of atonement through Yom Kippur as a day and the nature of atonement through the Sir Mishtaleh are actually totally different from one another. So he says, he has a reading in the Rambam to make with his point. He basically says there's two different types of tshuva that we can be talking about. We can talk about individual repentance and individual atonement, or we can be talking about collective national atonement, right? This like assumes a certain idea of like national corporate identity, that countries, a nation can be atoned for their sin. It's assuming that. And what Rabbi Soloveitchik here is asserting is that there's two different types of atonement that one can get. Atonement for every individual in Israel. That's one type of national atonement. And then there's another type, which is the nation itself as a body being atoned, as an independent corporate body being atoned. So that's to make that distinction. And then he says, fascinatingly, he says that, get the right line, Yom Kippur is the Zman Tshuva Lakol, La Yachid Rabim. Yom Kippur is the time of atonement for everyone. And then he says, and Yom Kippur does both of these things. It both atones for each individual, and it gives this national corporate atonement. He says, Ha'im hu adin b'nogeh lekapara shel asar la'azazel. Is the same true about the scapegoat? Does the scapegoat also have both of these expiatory functions? Hatshuva al kachi lo, b'shum open lo. Absolutely not. The scapegoat does not have both of these atoning functions. Kapparah, the Rav's novel idea, the scapegoat does not atone for individuals. It only atones for the corporate body of Israel, but it does not help any individual atone for their sins on an individual level. It only helps on a corporate level. Now this is really crazy in the following way. Think about what this means from a historical progression point of view, right? In the time of the temple, what was there? And this is within the Rambam's view, right? So within the Rambam, in the time of the temple, what did we have? We had the Sir Mishtaleh. That's the main mechaper. The main atonement is the scapegoat, which works on a national level. It actually doesn't work for individuals. So it was sort of hard. There was basically no free lunches in the time of the temple. There's no like automatic. You had to earn your kapparah. You had to bring whatever sacrifice and do whatever whatever you had to do. You couldn't just rely on and do a lot of tshuva. You couldn't just rely on the scapegoat for your own tshuva. That only works for national, corporate tshuva. Nowadays, we don't have the Shiur Shaleach. Instead, we have Yom Kippur. According to the Rav, Yom Kippur atones more broadly than the Shiur Shaleach. Yom Kippur now atones for every individual. So think about that for a second, right? It's not that like the time of the temple, we had the Shiur. That doesn't exist anymore. So Yom Kippur stands in, as if it's a pseudo sacrifice, stands in on its own as a day. No, that's not, it doesn't stand in at all, according to the Rabbi. It actually overtakes the Shiur Shaleach. Yom Kippur is stronger than the scapegoat. So what happens? The temple's destroyed. We lose our national corporate atonement. What happens? We get this bonus, this new thing called the Day of Yom Kippur that's actually stronger than the Shiur Shaleach. It both atones for on a corporate national level, and it atones for every individual. It's like a free pass to atonement. Now, I don't know if this is pshat in the Rambam. The Rambam seems very, very focused on tshuva, and here the Rav seems very focused on the Day of Yom Kippur against the Rambam. But within at least the Rav's reading of the Rambam, what happens with the destruction of the temple is not just a stand-in, not just a replacement. It's really a shift in the nature of atonement overall. Essentially, I think the best way to explain this, God looked at the world and said, I just destroyed my temple the second time. The people are not so good at keeping the Torah. They can't really keep this together. I make it easier. I need to find an easier path to atonement in order for this to work. Otherwise, this already failed twice. This is not gonna end well. So we need to have this sort of an easier path to atonement, through the Day of Yom Kippur, and not the Day of Yom Kippur replicating what the sacrifices did before, but the Day of Yom Kippur giving this added free pass. If you remember, a couple weeks ago we spoke about atonement through atonement that is earned, let's say by tshuva, the Meiri's view, versus atonement that is given by the grace of God, by a chesed elyon. We saw in Rishim Shofal Hirsch, I think it's also in Minchas China. Right? Is atonement through the grace of God, or is atonement earned? And I think what the Rabbi would have to say here within the Rambam is that in the time of the temple, atonement was earned on an individual level. Right? You couldn't get individual atonement through the Shiur Shaleach or through any other means. You had to earn it yourself through tshuva, through whatever other means. Nowadays, the Day of Yom Kippur atones on a personal level, regardless of whether one did tshuva or not. That is atonement by grace. That's atonement that's not earned, that's not deserved, that God just grants us, maybe because we wouldn't be able to withstand the world and the Torah otherwise. I think this is really a very radical idea that, again, we had our few options here, right? One option is you had Yom Kippur did the same thing then it did now. It was just redundant then, and now it's actually very necessary. Or Yom Kippur fills in for the Shiur, right? It used to be the goat would atone, and now Yom Kippur steps in and does that. According to the Rav, no. It actually is stronger. We actually have an upgrade to our atonement to overtake the atonement in the time of the temple, presumably because they're, just a reassessment of what sort of atonement we need. We can no longer rely on atonement that's earned. To understand that what replaces the Shiur Shaleach? What replaces the scapegoat? Fascinatingly, in the Rambam, surprisingly, right? According to most people, what replaces the scapegoat? The Day of Yom Kippur. But for the Rambam, I don't think that's really true. What does the Rambam say? The Rambam says the scapegoat in the time of the temple atones for everything. Nowadays, what atones for everything? What does the Rambam say? Right, let's take a peek back. Tshuva, yes. Take a peek back at source number 6. Right, it says, Torah. In the time of the temple, the scapegoat would atone for everything. Nowadays, nowadays, repentance atones for everything. So I think the way one can read it is sort of the opposite of the Rav, is that according to the Rambam, actually in the time of the temple, the scapegoat was an easy out. It was easier you can just get your automatic atonement for everything just by the sacrifice being brought. Nowadays, the main thing, true, the Day of Yom Kippur does do some things, but it's not the ultimate atoning factor anymore. Now, instead of this, in the time of the temple, the Shiur Shaleach was the main atoning factor, and tshuva was secondary. Nowadays, there's no more Shiur. Tshuva moves out to first place, and Yom Kippur is now the secondary atoning factor. So if you read the Rambam that way, which I think is very compelling, it actually comes out that the opposite shift happens, the opposite of what the Rav said, that in the time of the temple, the primary atoning agent was automatic, was by the grace of God, was the Sir Mishtalech. Nowadays, we don't have that privilege of just relying on the Sir Mishtalech. We have to earn our tshuva. The main thing is earn our kapparah. The main thing is tshuva, and without tshuva, you don't get too far at all. It's not like the Sir Mishtalech would give you stuff for free and give you a lot if you just had tshuva. No, nowadays Yom Kippur plays some role, but it's a relatively minor role. The main role is through tshuva. Tshuva meaning earning your atonement. That's the way atonement works nowadays. So I thought really two opposite ways of reading the Rambam, one based on the Rav, one based on, I think, the simpler meaning of the Rambam. And both of those portend a real shift when the temple is destroyed. Either we shift from earned atonement to atonement by grace, or vice versa. We shift from atonement by grace to earned atonement. But it sees more of a rupture in terms of the nature of the metaphysics of atonement with the destruction of the temple. Any thoughts, comments, ideas, theological objections, or whatnot to what we've seen?
I have a question. It might be like jumping a few steps though.
Sure, go for it.
Just in general, I forgot whose opinion it was about the fact that now there's like this radical change in the day of Yom Kippur. So then, is that to say that that's permanent? Like, if we were to go, like, if the temple were to be rebuilt, that the day would still take prominence? Because it seems like, I mean, there's so much that isn't known about like the future, but it seems like this like drastic change wouldn't necessarily be kept of like the day taking such prominence.
That's a very interesting question. So I think it may depend a little bit on the view here, right? If you take it on the views that essentially it's, Yom Kippur, the day of Yom Kippur takes over for the sacrifices due to necessity. You don't have the sacrifice, you need something. So the day does it without the sacrifice. On that view, probably once you rebuild the temple and have the sacrifices, assuming that all happens, then you'd go with the sacrifices. The day isn't necessary anymore. The only reason for the day was a stand-in. It's like a backup. And if you don't need the backup, you go with the original thing. Whereas what we were just seeing, these two views in the Rambam, that there was some like metaphysical change in the nature of atonement in the world, either moving in one direction or the other, then it's really an open question, right? You rebuild the temple. Does that mean that people are now fully deserving? People are now in a better position and can afford to always earn their atonement, even though now they didn't? Or is that now the situation where there should be extra privileges? Probably, if you think that the Sir Mishtalech is like an extra privilege, if you rebuild the temple, you probably would get the privilege back. But maybe the day of Yom Kippur would still have its role. I think it's pretty open within the Rambam's view that there's like a deeper metaphysical change, and the Ritva too. It's pretty open as to what the future is. I don't know if there's a clear answer. Whereas on the views that we saw, like the commentaries on the Yerushalmi, that whatever the sacrifice used to do, now the day does, and it only the day of Yom Kippur only works during the daytime because it's like a virtual korban. On those views, it really seems like once you have the real thing back, you'd go to it. But actually, what your question also, this question points to an interesting discussion in the Yerushalmi. We're not going to read it inside for reasons of time, but source 15 has this really cool discussion about it. Basically, the Yerushalmi seems to assume, and it's interesting that some of the Rishonim say like this Yerushalmi, some of them reject the Yerushalmi because they don't paskin like it. The Yerushalmi seems to assume that in the time of the temple, there was an option of either getting atonement through the scapegoat, through the Sir Mishtalech, or through the day of Yom Kippur. Yerushalmi seems to just take that for granted. And then we have, as we saw, all this discussion about it in the Rishonim. But Yerushalmi has a clear view that either one can work, but it's a little tricky. So it sounds like in the Yerushalmi, it says, in the time of the temple, maybe the day of Yom Kippur would not atone unless they didn't end up bringing the sacrifice. So it's really like a backstop, right? If you bring the Sir Mishtalech, then the Sir Mishtalech atones. If for whatever reason, I don't know, there's a goat shortage, or the goat gets lost, or whatever it is, you don't end up bringing it, then lucky for you, the last moment of Yom Kippur on this view, boom, Yom Kippur atones for all the sins instead of the scapegoat. And then there's a whole discussion as to, well, there's another view that Yom Kippur atones not just at the end of the day, but it atones at every moment. At every possible moment, it atones. It has that expiatory power at every moment. So then they said, what about a scenario where, what about a scenario where Yom Kippur is where you don't know in advance whether you're going to bring the goat or not, right? Let's say they're planning on bringing the goat, but in the end they don't bring the goat. So does Yom Kippur atone, like earlier in the day or not, right? Meaning, let's say you were planning on bringing your scapegoat at 3 p.m. And if that had gone according to plan, Yom Kippur is just the backstop. It would not have atoned. At the end, you lost your goat, and you don't end up bringing it. So Yom Kippur atones. But does Yom Kippur atone only like after you missed the boat at the end of the day, or does Yom Kippur atone already in the morning? So that sort of depends on whether God knows the future or not, right? The Yerushalmi actually has this really cool line. The Einachadosh Baruch Hu roes hanolad. Does God not know the future? V'yichaper miyad. What do you mean? If in fact in the future you're not going to end up bringing the sacrifice, the Sila Azazel, then the atonement of Yom Kippur should already be in place in the morning because God knows the future. So I thought that was really cool. Usually the Gemara doesn't explicitly talk about these very philosophical prospects of whether, propositions of whether God knows the future or not, but it's explicit in the Yerushalmi in source 15. In any event, I think, Talia, that relates to your point, right? This idea of like, what would it look like to have both going on? The Yerushalmi seems okay with it. The Yerushalmi seems happy to say you have both the goat atoning and Yom Kippur atoning, and those are sort of alternate options, and maybe one's the backstop for the other, but they can both be in place. Any other questions or comments or thoughts on the sugya? Last call. All right, so I think we have a very interesting sugya here. I think the question of is historical development to the nature of Yom Kippur as an atoning day, both on a technical level. I mean, obviously there's no sacrifices anymore, right? But on a deeper level, does something really change? Does Yom Kippur stand in for the sacrifices? Does Yom Kippur take on a new nature? Does the nature of atonement itself change over time? All of these things come up in these sugyos. I think it's very powerful and important idea. Next week, we'll sort of draw together the different parts of this series and bring it to a close just to get ready for Yom Kippur so that we know what we're getting ourselves into. Everyone should have a wonderful evening, and I think Michael has some more announcements.
Yes, thank you so much, Rabbi Zuckier. I just wanted to thank everyone for being here, and also to note that for those of you who have enjoyed being here, first of all, we have our final meeting next week, and we would hope to see you all back here. But second of all, that Drisha just announced its lineup of classes for the rest of 2020. We have 14 new classes that are being offered after the Chagim between October and December, and you can find information on all of those at drisha.org/classes. We've got a really phenomenal lineup, including a special focus with a number of shiurim that are focused on topics related to human dignity. Rabbi Zuckier will be teaching alongside many of our other faculty members, and we would encourage folks to check that out and to sign up for some of the stuff that we've got further down the road. But that is it. We look forward to seeing you back here next week, and Shana Tova, everyone.